The hyphen is a very unassuming piece of punctuation, bridging the large gap of a space between the islands of letters that we call words. In novels, poetry, newspapers, even hidden behind the backdrop of a speech like this one, the hyphen is brushed over, seen only as a pedestal upon which the words, the characters with real meaning, can stand. But to me, the hyphen holds a much higher position of importance. To me, the hyphen makes me who I am. The majority of my life has been spent in Britain, speaking English, making English friends, going to English schools. But there's one thing that separates me from this, and that is the humble hyphen in my name, the hyphen that divides the English half of my identity from the Spanish half, that divides Pascual from Simpson. The 21-letter title of my identity has been a challenge growing up, firstly when I began to learn to spell, and secondly, explaining to others how it was spelled. No, it's not written with a Q. Yes, it's spelled how it sounds. No, I'm not Italian. Yep, Spain is nice this time of year. All this made me feel different to my peers in some way. Not better, not worse, just different and isolated. Even in trivial things like football and the World Cup, although I know that can be controversial, my peers had the easy choice to support, well, England or England. But I was torn. I wanted to support Spain, to play devil's advocate, yes, but also because it was the part of my identity that rarely ever mixed with everyday life. But I also wanted to support England because, well, I've grown up here and it's an equal part of my identity. In the end, I supported the team that did the best, but that's beside the point. However, I've always had that underlying lack of belonging in everything. Having a nationality is a big part of a person's identity, and people are often really proud of where they're from. In a way, having a nationality is the biggest community that a person can be part of. And isn't it great? Cheering for your country's team in sport, meeting people of your nationality abroad, speaking your language with others in your community. It gives us a sense of purpose, of belonging to something greater than ourselves. Perhaps not by choice, but that makes it even stronger. It makes us even more determined to protect that unchangeable foundation of our identity. In a way, I have the best of both worlds. I can speak 2 languages, I get to communicate with more people, I get to experience 2 different cultures. But at the same time, I've often felt excluded from both worlds. I never felt like I fully had the right to support either football team. And in each country I went to, I didn't feel Spanish enough or English enough to claim the culture as my own. But culture, it's such a curious concept. I spent my life surrounded by the culture in this country so that I never paid it any attention because it was what I was used to. But I treasured Spanish culture, probably because only in the holidays could I visit and savour every little morsel of it. Every small fragment of the geography, the architecture, the people, the loud and energetic atmosphere that always excited and fascinated me. Every taste of the language on my tongue. It tasted of freedom, of equality between the 2 halves of my identity, and yet I still didn't belong. In my everyday life, I was seen as different and interesting, purely because I was half Spanish. It seemed to fascinate people to see a real-life bilingual person in the flesh, whereas in Spain, with my Spanish family who didn't speak that much English, I didn't feel Spanish enough. It was only half of my identity after all. But if I wasn't Spanish enough to be Spanish, then I wasn't English enough to be English. So what did that make me? I had to belong to somewhere, right? It didn't seem to matter much when I was flooded with questions about my family and my language. I admit, I liked it. It made me feel special. And so, from an early age, I learned that this part of my identity was my golden ticket of originality. I was half Spanish. And of course, I answered their endless floods of questionings of, how do you say this in Spanish, and can you really understand what they're saying? But it was more than that. In the relatively isolated area I grew up in, my culture was seen as different, unusual, exotic, purely because my father happened to be from another country. But I never questioned it because that was the way things had always been. I was unaware, however, that bilingualism on the global scale was the norm, with around 60% of the world population speaking more than one language. Within the UK, I was in 17.5%. Even without these statistics, I knew there was a problem. As modest as it may seem, I was getting too much attention for too little. My culture shouldn't have been as isolating or as interesting to others as it was my whole childhood. And this really reflects how the lack of cultural representation in British society. Maybe because we already speak the international language, we don't feel the need to learn about other cultures. But as a young adult, in a wider reality, in the real world with its beautiful variety and diversity, I am learning that I am no longer the isolated one, and that instead, Britain as a whole is isolated in its lack of cultural knowledge. Brexit was a hard time for my family. My father stopped speaking Spanish in public to me and my sister to avoid the glares and the disapproving glances. And even as a relatively ignorant 11-year-old, I learned that my dual nationality was no longer something to be proud of. It was just a coincidence of my identity that I had to live with. We thought of moving to Spain, of leaving the environment that was forcing us to bandage away half of ourselves. We had family over there after all, and we all spoke the language. But something must have convinced us to stay, a thin thread of hope somewhere, a promise that somehow things would improve if only we stuck with it. And in time, they did. Once the novelty wore off, and the spotlight was pulled away from anything European, things went back to how they had been before. But I've been thinking about that, and I realised that that wasn't an improvement. That was the bare minimum. And so, my point is that Britain needs to accommodate for other cultures. And I don't mean just acceptance and tolerance. I mean educating children to the point where they know the capital cities of the main countries in Europe, where they know that Africa is a continent and not a country, where they are curious to learn more and explore the world. And by doing this, we enrich their personal culture as well. By expanding our cultural knowledge, we enrich and enhance our own, on both a personal and a national level. And so I ask, why isn't bilingualism encouraged in schools? And why do bilingual children have to feel so isolated because of this? There are really only benefits to improving and enhancing your cultural knowledge, so why wait any longer? Read more, research more, speak to a wider variety of people. Open your minds. The world is at your fingertips with the internet, but there is so much of it that it won't come to you. You have to reach for it. My Spanish grandma, my abuela, passed away earlier this year, leaving me with no Spanish grandparents. Normally, I would visit her each year, but now, that homely side of my culture, softer and gentler than the busy bustle of the streets and the cities, has been snatched from me, leaving me even more distant from this part of my identity. But that has only made me even more determined to love both halves of my identity equally. And now I am learning and realising that there's such a wider global community of others with dual nationality that I no longer feel as isolated. And now I am learning that the hyphen in my name is something to love, not to ignore or hide away. Both halves of my identity are equally as important, and the hyphen joins them, not only to each other, but it joins them both to me. I cannot truly be myself without being both Spanish and English, and I wouldn't want it to be any other way. Thank you very much.